Globalization and Protectionism. In the early 1990s, most of the flat panel displays in American laptops came from Japan. The small US flat panel industry went to Washington and argued that Japanese firms were selling below fair value. Regulators agreed and slapped a 63% tax on imported displays. Protection, right? Here's what actually happened. Displays make up as much as half the cost of a laptop. So Apple moved its Macintosh plant to Ireland. Toshiba closed its US laptop factory. IBM scrapped plans for a plant in North Carolina and expanded in Japan instead. The policy meant to save American manufacturing pushed it out of the country. That's the puzzle worth understanding. Setting the stage. Start with the term. Protectionism is any policy a government uses to reduce or block trade in order to shield domestic producers. It comes in three forms. Tariffs are taxes on imports. The Trump administration raised tariffs on Chinese goods by 2 to 25%, covering televisions, monitors, desktop computers, and more. China retaliated, and a trade war followed. Import quotas are hard numerical limits. The Reagan administration capped Japanese auto imports. From 1974 to 2004, an international textile agreement divided the market by assigning each rich country a specific quota from each poor one. US sugar is still under quotas today. Non-tariff barriers are everything else. Rules, inspections, paperwork, safety standards, and labeling requirements that make importing slow or expensive. Rules of origin regulations are a good example. Some textiles get made in the United States, shipped abroad, combined with foreign fabric, and shipped back for final assembly, all to dodge tariffs or earn a "Made in the USA" tag. The scale of trade has grown enormously. In 1970, imports and exports were 11% of US GDP. Today, they're 32%. And the US is actually less connected than most countries. In Botswana, 97% of economic activity ties to trade, so the stakes are real. But who actually wins and loses when a country puts up a wall? The main idea: who pays for protection? Let's use sugar, and let's use numbers. Without trade, sugar in Brazil sells for 12 cents a pound, with 30 tons produced. In the United States, it's 24 cents a pound and 80 tons. Open up trade and companies buy cheap in Brazil to sell dear in America. Prices converge at 16 cents. Brazil produces 40 tons and consumes 25, exporting the 15-ton difference. The US produces 72 and consumes 87, importing that same 15. Total surplus rises in both countries. But look at who moves which direction. Brazilian producers gain and Brazilian consumers lose. American consumers gain and American sugar producers lose. Trade creates net winners, and it also creates specific losers who know exactly who they are. Now, add a quota of 7 tons. The US price climbs to 20 cents. The Brazilian price drops to 14. Partial protection lands somewhere between free trade and no trade. Here's where the surplus analysis matters. When the price rises, American sugar producers gain. They sell more at a higher price. American consumers lose, buying less at that higher price. Compare the two areas on the graph, and the consumer loss is always larger than the producer gain. The difference vanishes. Economists call it deadweight loss, and it means the country as a whole ends up with less. That's the heart of it. Protectionism is a subsidy from consumers to producers. It's just hidden, paid through higher prices instead of a check from the Treasury. Ambrose Bierce defined a tariff in 1911 as a scale of taxes on imports designed to protect the producer against the greed of his customer. Now the jobs question. When NAFTA was being negotiated, Ross Perot predicted a giant sucking sound as employers fled to Mexico for 1/8 the wages. NAFTA passed. The next 6 years brought some of the strongest job growth in US history. American jobs went from 71 million in 1970 to 150 million in 2021. Protection does save jobs in the protected industry, but it costs jobs elsewhere for 2 reasons. Consumers paying more for sugar have less money for everything else, so those industries shrink. And firms that buy the protected product now face higher input costs, so they lose sales. Protectionism reshuffles jobs. It doesn't create them, and it's expensive. Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas figures put the annual cost per job saved at $826,000 in sugar, $685,000 in dairy, and $199,000 in textiles and apparel. At that last number, you could pay those workers $100,000 a year to stay home and still spend half as much. On wages, trade raises the average because it raises productivity, but it doesn't lift everyone. Workers competing with imports see demand for their labor fall. Workers in exporting industries see it rise. Worth noting, about half of U.S. trade is with other high-wage countries, and many low-skill American jobs, lawn care, hotel work, moving furniture, can't be imported at all. The deeper look. 5 arguments for protection. 5 arguments come up repeatedly. Each has some merit, and each has a problem. The infant industry argument. Shield a new industry until it can stand on its own. Sensible in theory, hard in practice. Brazil closed its computer market from the late 1970s to about 1990. The result was an industry running 3 to 5 years behind world standards, which is an eternity in computers, while Brazilian buyers paid the bill. East Asia did better, and a World Bank study suggested why. Pick a few industries with real potential, avoid protecting inputs that other industries depend on, and set a firm end date. Korea tied protection to export performance, so failure meant the policy stopped. The anti-dumping argument. Dumping means selling below cost. There are 2 possible explanations. The innocent one is that supply and demand set prices, not costs. A going out of business sale is below cost too. The sinister one is predatory pricing, driving out rivals and then raising prices. But while foreign firms have driven out domestic competitors, there are 0 documented cases of them jacking up prices afterward. Meanwhile, calculating cost of production turns out to be more art than science, and the process attracts politics. The environmental argument. The worry is a race to the bottom, with firms fleeing to countries with weak rules. It hasn't really happened. Environmental compliance runs about 1 to 2% of a big plant's costs, far less than labor, transportation, or taxes. And companies usually build the same plant design everywhere, so foreign-owned plants in low-income countries often comply better than local ones. The unsafe products argument. Countries can absolutely set their own safety standards under WTO rules. They just have to be scientifically based and applied evenly to domestic and imported goods. Mattel's 2007 recall of 2 million lead-painted toys shows the concern is genuine. The national interest argument. If the worry is losing access to foreign oil, blocking imports is backwards. You'd burn through domestic reserves faster. Stockpiling makes more sense, which is what the Strategic Petroleum Reserve does. And the label gets abused. In 1954, wool and mohair were declared strategic materials for military uniforms. The mohair subsidies ran, off and on, for nearly 50 years. Wrapping up, a few things to carry with you. Protectionism takes 3 forms: tariffs, quotas, and non-tariff barriers. All 3 raise domestic prices. It works as a hidden subsidy from consumers to producers, and the consumer loss exceeds the producer gain every time. It shifts jobs between industries rather than adding them, at a cost per job that often runs into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. The common arguments for restricting imports each contain a real concern, but protection is rarely the best tool for addressing any of them. Trade policy gets made at 3 levels. Globally through the WTO, which grew out of the 1947 GATT agreement, regionally through arrangements like the European Union and the agreement now called USMCA, and nationally through quotas and dumping investigations. Average tariffs in industrialized countries fell from 40% in 1946 to under 5% by 1990, though that trend shifted after 2016. Here's the closing thought. Picture a company that invents a technology, letting it make better goods for less. Competitors lose money and lay people off. Should we ban the invention? Almost nobody says yes. Now suppose the technology is simply importing. Same disruption, same result. Trade is a kind of technology, and the answer to disruption is helping the people disrupted, not stopping the progress. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.